Hello everyone and welcome to a new video on this channel. This time we'll take a closer look at AKS authentication or authenticating to Azure Kubernetes Service. This is all about Azure AD integrated AKS clusters. We'll look at how to interactively sign into these clusters with AAD, but also how to bypass AAD. And we'll also take a look at how to use an AAD account to log in to your cluster from a pipeline using the kube-login tool. But that's more near the end of this video. Now, a little bit of context. Of course, this is all about how do you access the API server of Kubernetes. And of course, you need to authenticate to that API server. So we look at how that authentication is done using an AAD account. We'll not have a detailed look at authorization or creating roles and role bindings and so forth. That's for maybe some other time. And also we don't look at admission control here. So we focus on the authentication part. And authentication in Kubernetes is of course done via plugins. The most common way of authenticating to Kubernetes is probably using a client certificate. And I'll show you also an example of how that is done and how that works in this video. But the focus will surely be on Azure AD integration. And that's done through the OpenID Connect features that Kubernetes provides. Let's first check what kind of cluster we have deployed here. So it's an AKS cluster 1.18.14. But if you look at the cluster configuration you see here, indeed, we have Kubernetes RBAC enabled, which is a requirement, a prerequisite for Azure Active Directory integration. We have chosen the AKS managed integration. There's also a legacy method to enable AAD integration, but you should not really use that. Go for the AKS managed integration. And part of the configuration of this integration, you can also specify the groups that you would like to have as administrators. So members of the group you see over there, ID of that group, they have full admin rights to the cluster. Let's check also how this is deployed using an ARM template. If you go to my GitHub to gebake/Azure deploy, you'll find in the AKS folder a deploy.json. That's how I deploy my AKS cluster with an attached workflow as well. Now, the configuration of the AAD integration is in this case is totally at the bottom. So I'll scroll to the bottom. We won't look at the existing options here. And at the bottom, you can clearly see in the AAD profile section that I turned on AAD integration using the managed AAD option. And indeed, I can specify the group object IDs that I want to have as full administrators on this cluster. And in this case, I'm just specifying this group ID via a parameter I can submit to the ARM template. Okay, now we can try to gain access to our cluster from our local machine. I'm here in Windows subsystem for Linux. This is a Ubuntu 18.04, I think, but this will just as well work on macOS, plain Linux, just Windows as well. Doesn't really matter that much. So what I want to do now is I want to gain access using kube control or kubectl or whatever you want to call it, and for example to list the nodes. Now if I do so with kget nodes, and that's just an alias for kubectl, of course. So it's the same thing on my system. Yeah, that does not work because I have no configured config file. The config file, by the way, will be saved to the .kube folder, but I'm already in that .kube folder in my home folder. To actually get the config folder or config file, I can use AKS and then get credentials. Just specify the name of my cluster and the resource group of the cluster, and I can do the actual work. Now, you have to be aware here that you need to be in a specific role in Azure in order to be able to use the above command and pull the config file. So at least you have to have the following one. I just use AZ role definition list. And indeed, I can see here that there is an Azure Arc, but also a normal Azure Kubernetes Service cluster user role. So at least that role your account should have. So the account that you're using with the Azure CLI, in this case, in my case, on my system, your account should have that first role there, or it won't be able to pull the kubeconfig. In my case, that's okay, because my user is a contributor, which is the highest role below owner. So of course I have that access right. So that means now there should be a config file in the kube folder, and indeed there's a config file. If we look at the config file, you see it contains some information like my certificate authority data, that's my CA cert. I see that my server name is there, the full name of the server name, of course HTTPS. But although I see my username over there, there's a user called cluster user, etc. You'll find that over here, cluster user and so on. There's no information there that actually says that I'm Geert Baken and I want to connect to the cluster as Geert Baken. There is of course information there about the authentication provider. So in case the command line tool requires access rights, it can actually ask for my credentials. And that's something that will happen from the moment that we try to do something that requires credentials. Let's see what that does. For example, if I do get nodes now in this case, let's see what happens. Now there he asks, well, you'll need to provide me information about who you are. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to open the device login page. That's on a different screen. You won't see that. I'm just going to copy the code. And of course now I authenticate with my user account. That's my Geert Baken account in my organization's Active Directory. And from the moment that is done successfully, of course, Kubernetes will check if I have the required role, the required RBAC role in Kubernetes. Can I list the nodes? In this case, I can, because the user I authenticated with is part of that AAD integration group I talked about earlier. And that group, of course, has full access rights to the cluster. So this is great. Let's look now at our config file, because something must have changed here. So if we go to the config file, you'll see that indeed it has still the same CA cert. That's fine. But I also now see that in the users listing, the users listing starts here. This is the name of the actual user, so to speak. There's an access token provided. Let's say JWT or a JOT or whatever you want to call it. And this token contains information about myself. That's interesting. So let's see if we can grab this token. It's not base64 encoded or something like that, so I can just grab the token like this. And I have a tool on my machine here, which is the JWT tool. If I run that tool, it gives me information about what's inside that token. For example, it tells me things like what's my family name, what's my given name, the groups that I am a member of. Other information as well is provided, my unique name, that's my UPN in the organization that I'm part of, and so on. So of course this token tells the system, okay, who am I, what are your group memberships, and based on the group memberships I have full access rights to do whatever I want to do inside the Kubernetes cluster. So I can clear this out. You might wonder how I get the access rights at the Kubernetes level. That's not that difficult, because when you're doing the AAD integration, in this case the managed AAD integration with AKS, what is done for you is that a cluster role binding will have been created. So there's a cluster role binding, you can see it here on the screen. It's called the AKS cluster admin binding -AAD. And if you look closer at the YAML in that cluster role binding, at the bottom here you'll see that indeed the cluster admin role has been given to the group with this ID over here. Now what group is that? Again, that's the group that I have configured during the AAD integration. That group gets, of course, full admin rights on the cluster, but it gets the full admin rights because of the automatic creation of this cluster role binding. Now, what do you do if you want to bypass AD? And can you bypass AAD to get credentials to your cluster? Well, of course you can, but of course only if you're in the proper role. So here I'm doing an AZ role definition list and so on to look for a Azure Kubernetes Service cluster admin role. And indeed such a role exists. A user like this can actually pull a kubeconfig that gets full admin rights without actually supplying a AAD user. Again, because I am logging on or logged on as a contributor, I already have this role, so I can, of course, do what I want to do. What does that mean? That means that I can now do AZ get credentials or AZ AKS get credentials, and I can pass the --admin flag at the end. By the way, this is something that the AKS team is working on to actively prevent doing this when you have AAD integration. Some organizations have requested this capability to turn this off, so that you're always coming in as an AAD user. In this case, at this point in time, I can still do this. When I do this, of course, I can see the following happening, just a normal pulling of a kubeconfig. But if I'm doing less and then config, what you'll now see is that we indeed have a somewhat different looking config file. If you're looking closely, you see that my user now is called cluster admin, followed by the resource group of my cluster and the name of my cluster. And I'm now authenticating to the cluster using client certificates. So I have a client certificate here. So here, that's my client certificate. And of course, you have to have a client key as well. So the key is in your kubeconfig file. You can see that here. The key is listed over here. Now, let's take a look at the client certificate data and see what it looks like. So if I'm copying this and I'm leaving my kubeconfig, what I can do now is I can actually save this as a certificate. To do so, I will just, to make it very simple, I will echo this data, which is now in this case, this is base 64 encoded. We will base 64 decode it, right? And we will also send this to a client cert.cert file. So a file we can then take a look at with the OpenSSL tooling. So I can do OpenSSL, then x509 -in the client cert file, and then text no out, right? And if I do so, I can look inside the certificate. And when I look closely inside the certificate, what I see here is the user that this certificate is for. That's the common name here. CN is master client, but also a group, which is done through the, I think it's organization, this organization or system : masters, right? So I'm actually coming into Kubernetes with this client certificate that contains this subject. And of course, then we need to match this to actual access rights. So what are the access rights of this user? Well, we can take a look in our cluster role binding, which is the cluster admin role binding. So if I do get a cluster role binding, and I'm looking at the role binding, which is called the cluster admin role binding, and I should type this correctly, and then I look at the YAML as well, what you'll see is that indeed this role binding gives the cluster role cluster admin, that means full access, to a group called system : masters. And as you have seen, that's the group that's inside my certificate. So this client certificate that I'm pulling with this --admin gives me full access rights to the cluster, and I don't even have to go to AAD to prove who I am, because I effectively bypass AAD with this --admin flag. What we have seen so far is great when you work interactively on the command line. For example, if you're getting a kube-config file and then you log on with AAD credentials, you can submit the code to the browser and it all works fine. But what if you want to authenticate to Kubernetes from a pipeline, let's say an Azure DevOps pipeline or a workflow in GitHub, and you do not want to use full admin credentials, so you don't want to do a --admin, for instance, to connect to your Kubernetes cluster, and you want to use an AAD account. Well, of course, in such a pipeline which is not running interactively, you cannot go to a browser and authenticate in that browser. You have to do something specific for that. It's important to know that there's a tool which is called kube-login. I actually installed that tool on my machine, but if you run that, you're not seeing that much happening. The tool requires you to use it in a specific way. So I'm not going to show a pipeline, but I'm just going to pretend that we are running in a pipeline here and see how that works. The idea of the tool is, of course, that you're using some kind of service principal. So for example, suppose you'd like to create a service principal in your Azure Active Directory and you'd like to call it my AKS AD login, right? So this creates a service principal and you'll get things like a client ID and a client secret as output from this command. And of course you save that somewhere. The next thing then would be to give this service account, this service principal, access rights on your cluster. For example, you could make it member of a group and then use cluster roles and cluster role bindings to give this account, this service account, the proper role-based access control on your Kubernetes cluster. I'm not doing that now, but I can tell you that the service principal that I already created is my AKS AD login. I made it member of that group I've used earlier, part of the AAD setup. So it's member of a group that has full access to the cluster, just for illustration purposes. So what we want to do now is, of course, make sure that we can do a AAD login, but non-interactively. How do we do that? Well, first of all, you should export a couple of environment variables. So in your pipeline, for example, you should actually do an export of, in this case, AAD service principal client ID. And this is, by the way, the actual client ID of the service principal that I created. And then next, you should also export the or have an environment variable for the client secret. Of course, this will be blurred out, but now I have my client ID and my client secret set in variables, right? Now, of course, I still need to have a kube-config. I need a kube-config that can get me started, right? How do I do that? Well, we know this already. We do az AKS and then get credentials, of course. And I'm not using --admin. That would not be the one I want because I want to use an AAD account. Of course, this means that in your pipeline, you need to make sure that you're, for example, running an Azure CLI task of some sort, and that the account that you're using to run the Azure CLI task has the access right to pull the kube-config. And that's, of course, a requirement. Otherwise, this command will not work. And as you know already, when you run this command in a pipeline, or when you just run this command doesn't ask anything. It just saves the config file. Yeah, that's all it does. Now, what we now want to do is we want to use kube-login to convert this kube-config file to do the authentication to AAD automatically. So when I do this in my pipeline, I would run the following command: kube-login, then convert my kube-config, and I'm also giving it this SPN parameter. So when I do so, this is what happens. Nothing, right? But of course, something will have changed in my config file. So if we look at the config file, let's just do that with cat and then config, you'll see that something has changed what you haven't seen before. So I still see the user, cluster user, but then you see an exec and all other kinds of stuff. Yeah, kube-login is actually a plugin to kube control, right? And in this case, he's not putting in things like my access tokens and so on, but it actually says, hey, you know what, when you're going to, or when you're running commands against the API server, here's enough information to do what you need to do to log in, to pass the token to the API server, and so forth. So this will do all the work in the background here. Of course, it will use those exported environment variables to come in with that user account. So, okay, yeah, that's fine. This is what's in our kube config. In the pipeline, of course, this will be inside the kube config on the pipeline machine, or the machine that runs the pipeline. So what I now expect is when I do k get nodes, I do not expect to get a pop-up that asks me to log on to Azure AD. No, I've told to kube-login to use that service principal. And in the background, kube-login and the exec plugin will do all the necessary work to obtain the token and then to submit the token of that service principal to the API server. I don't have to do anything special for that. So this should just work without getting prompted. Let's see if that's indeed the case. K-get nodes, and yes. And with this, we've come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching and take care.